I'm pleased to introduce the architect of our entire Lincoln Lecture Series, Professor and our Associate Director here, Jonathan Earl. Please welcome John.
Welcome. One of the things that's great about the Dole Institute of Politics is that we don't just serve KU or Lawrence, but we have the entire state as our constituency. And joining us tonight for this presentation via internet connection are Neosho County Community College in Chanute, Seward County Community College in Liberal, and Labette Community College in Parsons, Kansas. And I think it's great that there's this much interest in our presidential lecture series. And I thank everyone at these locations for tuning in tonight. Of the scores of books to be published this year on Abraham Lincoln, perhaps the one I've looked forward to the most is A. Lincoln by Ron White. As you may have noticed during our first two lectures in this series, I have been especially interested in bringing scholars here who take both a deep and a wide look at our greatest president. Believe me, there are plenty of books out there, some of them extraordinarily good, about Lincoln's last day or his best speech, what we call slice books. But when somebody sets out to capture an entire life in one volume, he or she usually has a far more nuanced portrait than someone interested in this smaller tranche or slice. A. Lincoln is an excellent example of this and special in several respects. I'll try to explain a couple of them in the short time I have. To begin with, it's the first comprehensive single-volume biography of Lincoln since David Donald's Pulitzer Prize winner in 1996, the year that Bill Clinton defeated Bob Dole in the presidential election. That's getting to be a long time ago. During these 13 years, important new resources have become available, such as the recent publication of Lincoln's voluminous legal papers, and have added to what we know about this much-studied man. I'll give you one example. We're used to having lawyers as presidents, right? After the last 8 years, it might be a while before we hire another one with an MBA, but lawyers seem to be perennial favorites. The last two Democratic presidents have even been constitutional lawyers and law professors. Great. But how many cases did Bill Clinton or Barack Obama ever argue before a judge or a jury? Not too many. How many wills did they execute? Or railroad or utility regulations did they commit to memory? Professor White argues persuasively that Lincoln's legal experience taught him a profound appreciation for his opponent's point of view. He subscribed during his entire career to many Southern newspapers as well as Northern ones, continuing to read them even during the Civil War whenever he could. Lincoln did an ability to put himself in other men's shoes, refusing, for example, to lay the blame for the curse of slavery solely on the South. I think this is one of the qualities that makes a good leader great, and it's not something that many scholars credit Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, with. Ron White is also taking great pains to make this book, A. Lincoln, accessible to the general reader, not just the specialist. Important terms are defined and defined eloquently. Historical concepts are explained in plain English. It is beautifully written. As Bill Lacey said, a reviewer for USA Today said, if you buy one book on Lincoln this bicentennial year, make it this one. Ronald C. White Jr. earned his PhD from an extremely reputable institution in central New Jersey called Princeton, and has taught at UCLA, Princeton Theological Seminary, Whitworth University, Colorado College, among several others. I first met him when we were both readers at the wondrous and bucolic Huntington Library in San Marino, California, where much of the research and writing of this book was completed. White is the author and editor of 7 other books, including Lincoln's Greatest Speech about the Second Inaugural, and The Eloquent President, a portrait of Lincoln through his words. He has lectured widely on Lincoln at the White House, Library of Congress, Gettysburg, and was interviewed on the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. He lives with his wife Cynthia in La Cañada, California, just up the hill from Pasadena, and it is my pleasure to welcome my friend Ron White to the Dole Institute of Politics. Ron.
Thank you, John, for that too extensive introduction. It's really delightful to be here with you this evening. I've had a tour of the Dole Institute this afternoon. I'm sure all of you... Got to get mic'd up here. Can you hear me now a little bit better? Okay. I'm sure all of you understand what a treasure this place is. I was down in the bowels of the institution to see the archives. I've long admired Bob Dole, one of the last, I'm afraid, of people who were nonpartisan in his politics, even as a partisan Republican. How we wish for those days, do we not, where people could get along and appreciate people even of the other party. I'm privileged to speak this year in the Lincoln Bicentennial. Just think of it. Here we are spending all of this time and all of this energy and all of these celebrations about a single person. I was saying to some folks at dinner that about 8-10 weeks ago I got a call from the State Department asking me if I would lecture on Lincoln in Italy and Germany. And I said, why? They said, because Europeans are fascinated by Abraham Lincoln. I said, why? They said, because I think that they understand that however great Washington would have been or Jefferson would have been, Lincoln embodies the American story. One can begin in the most humblest of places, in Lincoln's case with less than 1 year of formal education, and rise. Lincoln celebrated what he called the right to rise. And so people in other parts of the world are fascinated especially by Lincoln because he embodies the American experience. At the end of our talk, I'm going to ask you a question. Why should we still be talking about Lincoln, however, in 2009? Let's see if we can think about that in our brief time together. I'd like to really begin with a question. How many of you have been to the Lincoln Memorial? I'd like you to get in touch with perhaps the first time you were there. You may have gone there on a school trip, or perhaps recently you went with children or grandchildren. You recall when you arrive, you walk up that incredible memorial, and the first thing you see is that tall Daniel Chester French statue, 29 feet high. The Park Service people tell us it's still the second most visited place in Washington, second almost only to the Vietnam Memorial. I suspect maybe in 2009 it will occupy first place. As you walk into that templed space, if you turn to the left, carved on one panel is the Gettysburg Address. If you turn to the right, carved on 3 panels is the second inaugural address. Would several of you be willing to just give voice to your experience? What was it like to be there? I know that this is being recorded. I will repeat what you say. This is going to be very interactive. What was it like for you? Anyone? What was your feet? Emotional. Awe-inspiring. Overwhelming. Well, the point of my biography is, however awe-inspiring or emotional or overwhelming it is, none of those feelings is the same thing as understanding. A recent poll of historians suggested what probably many of us might vote here this evening, that Lincoln is our most revered president. But to say that is not to say that we fully understand. 2 weeks ago, I was invited to teach in the newest site that you would want to visit in Washington, the so-called President Lincoln's Cottage. This is where Lincoln spent his summers, 3, 4, even 5 months. It was called the Soldiers' Home. It was where retired soldiers lived. And in 2007, in September, it was restored and opened exactly as it was when Lincoln lived there. And I was asked to teach a group of teachers, junior high and high school teachers, selected teachers, who had applied and been accepted to teach Lincoln in our public school system. And so in a rather routine way, I went around the room and said, would you please introduce yourself and tell us how is Lincoln being taught in the public school system? I must admit I was pretty taken aback by what they said. They were struggling to find a place that Lincoln might be taught. We were strategizing how we might insert Lincoln into a class on leadership, how maybe world history we could work him in. And it's come to me as I've talked with teachers all across the country that Lincoln isn't necessarily being taught in a way that is central to our American story. So my attempt this evening is to just give you a few windows from my biography of why we might be talking about Lincoln in 2009. Let me start with this. What may surprise you is how much we're yet learning about Lincoln. I don't mean Lincoln's scholarship. I mean Lincoln, his own letters, papers. For example, about 20 years ago, a professor at Sangamon State College in Illinois got it into his head that if Lincoln was this prolific lawyer, and he practiced almost throughout the whole state, Could it be that there were still Lincoln legal papers in the 102 Illinois county courthouses? So he assembled a team of master's students, and they searched those courthouses, and they found hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Lincoln legal papers, rolled up, mostly turned blue, and invariably with Lincoln's name razor-bladed out. Now, what that meant was the earliest way to collect Lincoln in the 19th century was to get his autograph. 2 years ago, a man from Longmont, Colorado, turned on his internet and clicked on the National Archives site. He wanted to see some photographs, and he was watching one that was labeled "The First Inauguration of Ulysses S. Grant." But as he looked carefully at the photograph, he said, well, this is very strange. Why would there be all these soldiers there at the first inauguration of Ulysses S. Grant? Surely this is not Grant's inauguration. This must be Lincoln's second inauguration. So he telephoned the National Archives. He said, I don't mean to be impertinent, but I think you've made a mistake. And they said, oh, for goodness sakes, for all these years we have misclassified this photograph. You are right. This is a photograph of Lincoln's second inaugural address that we did not know was in existence. And I could go on, but I won't. Our first window into Lincoln is Lincoln the politician. You and I have just been through the longest political campaign in American history. 2 years. I hope it doesn't get any longer. And in those 2 years, I sense we were looking for candidates who we understood they had ego to run for the presidency, but who had some sense of ambition. But we hoped we found someone who had also a sense of service, maybe even an element of humility. Lincoln first runs for political office when he is barely 22 years old. Born in Kentucky, at age 9 he moves with his parents to Indiana, and at age 21 he accompanies his parents into Illinois. He then settles in the little village of New Salem, 125 residents. I had great fun 2 weeks ago in Chicago, reminding the folks of that great city that when Lincoln settled in New Salem and was persuaded to run for office to represent them, Chicago had barely 60 citizens. And New Salem thought they had a much brighter future than Chicago. And so they pushed Lincoln forward. I think he pulled himself, and he ran for political office. He lost. But in that 1832 election, where he had been a resident of New Salem for less than 9 months, in the region right around New Salem, of the 307 votes cast, he received 270. In 1834, he ran again, and of the 14 candidates running for 4 political seats, he won. The first selection this evening that's inside your program is Lincoln's first declaration for political office. I'd like you to turn to it and read it with me. I'll read it, and you read along with me. In that day, people announced their candidacy in the local newspaper, and so did Lincoln. And this is what he writes. He's not yet 23 years old. Every man is said to have his peculiar ambition. Whether it be true or not, I can say for one that I have no other so great as that of being truly esteemed of my fellow men, by rendering myself worthy of their esteem. He then becomes autobiographical. How far I shall succeed in gratifying them, this ambition is yet to be developed. I am young and unknown to many of you. I was born and have remained in the most humble walks of life. I have no wealthy or popular relations to recommend. How is this for a definition of political ambition? Rendering myself worthy of their esteem. At the center of my biography is my attempt to try to understand, which we can never fully understand, how it is that Lincoln's moral center grows, how this interior moral compass takes root in him. Lincoln runs again in 1834 and wins. By 1836, he is the leader, still in his 20s, of the Whig Party in the Illinois state legislature. Now, we have to understand who this is. The portrait that I portray is of a very human Lincoln. This is not the marble man of the Lincoln Memorial. He's a man who, as a young man, his humor can hurt His satire can bite. He is opportunistic. As quite a young man, he caught up perhaps in his own machismo. He very foolishly agrees to fight a duel, which almost comes off. He is so embarrassed by his behavior that he doesn't want to talk about it for the rest of his life. But yet we watch this man begin to grow. But how does he grow and develop in comparison to the peers around him? A second window. I suggest that he grows by his remarkable ability at public speaking. Today we have sometimes conflated writing and speaking. They're not the same thing at all. Lincoln's two secretaries, who wrote their biography in 1890, said Abraham Lincoln would have been very surprised that he was remembered as a great writer, but he would not have been surprised that he was remembered as a great speaker. I don't particularly like teleprompters, where I get the sense that someone is not speaking to me, but they're reading to me. Lincoln spoke, and his speaking was powerful. His first attempt at a major speech is the second selection. In 1837, he moved from New Salem to Springfield. He had been instrumental in moving the capital of Illinois to Springfield. It wasn't there, but he was there. And he joined what was called the Young Men's Lyceum. This was an opportunity for young men to practice their speaking and debating abilities. Lincoln's turn came on a cold winter evening, January 1838. I take a lot of time in my biography to trace Lincoln's development as a speaker. I like to say to students, less is more, or there is no such thing as good writing, there's only good rewriting. You may think that Lincoln was this spontaneous genius who with a stroke of a pen could write out a speech. Not so at all. Lincoln worked very, very hard to develop himself as a public speaker. And here is the first example. He often begins a speech by being very aware of the context around him. Lincoln's speech is animated by what he calls the problem of mob violence in America, or mobocracy. And he actually names the mob violence in 6 or 7 states of the United States. I think mostly on his mind was what had happened 4 months before, just a little bit south of Springfield in Alton, Illinois. Elijah Lovejoy, the Presbyterian minister and editor of an abolitionist newspaper, had been killed in the streets by a mob, and Lincoln was aghast by this. So he asks this question in the center of his address: how then shall we perform it? At what point shall we expect the approach of danger? Shall we expect some transatlantic military giant to step the ocean and crush us at a blow? Never. All the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined, with all the treasure of the earth in their military chest, with a Bonaparte for a commander, could not by force take a drink from the Ohio or make a track on the Blue Ridge in a trial of 1,000 years. At what point then is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reaches, it must spring up amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. Lincoln hasn't quite mastered the notion that less is more. His speech is a little bit too flowery, but he has a deep moral center here, and it's almost eerie, is it not, in his prediction looking down little more than 2 decades at the time we almost did die by suicide. But the modern question, did Lincoln write his own speeches? Another window. We've become all too accustomed, have we not, to speechwriters. When I published my first book, Lincoln's Greatest Speech, I received an email one day from the White House. I was ready to delete it, thinking, oh, here's another spammer or spoofer on me. But it was an invitation to come to the White House, and I was invited to have lunch with several of President Bush's aides, including Michael Gerson, his chief speechwriter. I learned that President Bush had, I think it was 7 or 8 speechwriters, and they told me that Bill Clinton had 9 speechwriters. couple of years later, I was invited to give a lecture at the White House, and when the lecture was over, several young people came up afterwards and said, "Oh, we're the researchers for the speechwriters." There were 9 researchers for the speechwriters. Well, Lincoln wrote his own speeches with 2 major exceptions, and I want to focus on one. His inaugural address, I think, probably prompted in him a sense of nervousness that he had never felt before. Yes, he was a successful Illinois politician, stump speaker, debater, but now he was going to speak on a national stage. So he showed the speech, the draft of a speech, he used several drafts, to several Illinois friends. 2 of them said great. The third made a substantial but brief suggestion. At the Huntington Library where I work, we have the draft of that suggestion to hold it in your hand, where Orville Browning of Illinois makes a suggestion to Lincoln. But then Lincoln arrives in Washington, and whatever impulse motivated him, I can't quite understand it. He arrives, you remember, incognito on Saturday morning. Sunday he goes to church with William Seward at St. John's Episcopal on Lafayette Square, and after lunch with Seward, his rival, Republican rival, now Secretary of State designate, he says to Seward, "I have a draft of my speech here. Would you be willing to take a look at it? And if you have a few suggestions, I would be welcome to hear them." That evening there's a knock at the door, parlor suite number 6 at the Willard Hotel. Standing in the door is Frederick Seward, William's son, and he hands to the president-elect an envelope. Lincoln closes the door and opens the envelope, and inside are 7 pages of suggestions. 49 suggestions by Seward as to how to improve his inaugural address. Seward had actually taken a red pen and numbered every single line of Lincoln's speech. But probably most amazing to Lincoln was when he got to page 6, he reads to himself, Seward says, "Your last paragraph will never do. Toss it out. Here, I have written 2 new last paragraphs for you. You may choose which one to use." Well, if we turn in our program for this evening, you will see that I have divided into 2 columns the paragraph that Seward gives to Lincoln and that Lincoln decides to use. So on the left column are the 4 sentences that are Seward's sentences, and on the right are the 4 sentences by which Lincoln revises Seward's words. Seward begins, "I close." Lincoln, "I am loath to close." Now, I think probably all of us here this evening recognize that the first way we would want to edit or revise is to cut. Cut those extraneous words. Students know this, I'm sure. Cut those extra adjectives and adverbs. But what's going on here? Lincoln doesn't cut, he extends. Well, here's an extra credit question. Why does he extend? Let me help us answer this question by learning the way Lincoln wrote. Lincoln read with what he called 2 senses, the sense of the eye and the sense of the ear. He always read out loud to the consternation of his law partner, Willie Herndon. Abraham read to Mary, Mary read out loud to Abraham. I learned in preparing this work that in American public education, children always read out loud in our public school systems until the 1920s or 1930s, when some bright teacher said, "Shh, Johnny, read to yourself, you're disturbing Mary." I say to students, if you want to improve your paper, you read your paper out loud or have a roommate read your paper out loud, and you'll hear things you will never hear by reading it silently. So I want to suggest that we say Lincoln's sentence out loud together, and then you will hear, I believe, what Lincoln is doing in his change. Lincoln spoke very slowly, 110 words per minute. You and I speak about 150 words a minute. So let's say it very slowly. I am loath to close. Now, Jonathan, in his kind introduction, suggested I didn't use technical words, and for the most part that's correct, Jonathan. I went back and looked, and I actually did use a technical word. It's the word assonance. It's the sense where you take words of similar sound and put them together. Do you hear it? I am loath to close. The power and the effect of the sentence is extended by that understanding. I said earlier Lincoln was not a good speaker, often extemporaneously. When the victories at Vicksburg and Gettysburg came, the crowd came to the White House to serenade him. He didn't want to speak, but he felt he had to. So he began that day, what was it, 80-some odd years ago, that 4 months later, the same idea, 77 years ago, our forefathers, give him time, the sense of the cadence. He didn't call it the King James Bible, he called it the Saxon Bible with its strong one-syllable words. Now the second sentence is the one that Barack Obama used in what I thought was his marvelous speech on November 4, 2008. I don't think he would have been quoting Seward, who said, we must not be aliens or enemies, but fellow countrymen and brethren. Lincoln, we are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Lincoln, who loved the Psalms, who committed them to memory, knew that the psalmists, plural, often would use the same idea twice for emphasis, saying the same truth in just a little bit different way. We'll skip the third sentence and we'll go to the fourth, and in our historical imagination this evening, we will picture Lincoln standing with the envelope in his hand. He's now come to page 7, and he reads to himself the mystic chords which, proceeding from so many battlefields and so many patriot graves, pass through all the hearts and all the hearths in this broad continent of ours, will yet again harmonize in their ancient music when breathed upon by the guardian angel of the nation. My goodness sakes, what can I do with this? But watch what he does with it. It is absolutely magical. He turns Seward's ideas into poetry. Let's say it out loud very slowly together. The mystic chords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. Lincoln's gift was his words, and one reason we're still speaking about him tonight, we teach the words of others in this great university in history classes or political science classes or literature classes, but we don't cite them in 2009. They're there in the past and they deserve to be studied and they deserve to be appreciated, but we don't bring them forward at celebrations of 9/11 or other celebrations when we want to hear something that rallies our whole sense of what it means to be American. Another window. A modern question rising in the last 25 to 35 years is, what did Lincoln really think about slavery, and what did he really believe about African Americans? A book was written in the early part of this decade called Abraham Lincoln's White Dream. Forced into Glory, Abraham Lincoln's White Dream. And I have been in many places in this country where I have been told that Abraham Lincoln is a racist, or that Abraham Lincoln cared little for African Americans. Now sometimes this is done in a very selective way. For example, the favorite quotation to buttress this position is often taken from the fourth debate with Stephen Douglas at Charleston, where Lincoln begins one section by saying, "It's not that I'm about to marry a black woman." Of course, that wasn't possible. "It's not that I believe that blacks should serve on juries. It's not that I, but dear friends, do we not understand Lincoln was a debater? The whole point of debating is to concede what you believe to be the secondary points. That's exactly the tactic of a lawyer who will stand before the jury and almost admit, I know that Mr. So-and-so, but in the middle of that, Lincoln says, but this black woman, and he doesn't choose a man, he chooses a woman, this black woman, in her ability to earn a right to earn the bread from her own hands, is every bit my equal. And then I think he paused for the longest time and said, and the equal of every single person here, because all men are created equal. Lincoln brought out of the dust, really, of the 19th century. We may want to talk about this in the questions and comments, how the Declaration of Independence had fallen into disuse. But as Lincoln re-enters the political sphere in 1854, he brings it front and center. And what finally motivates him in the debates with Stephen Douglas is the morality of the Declaration. It was not simply the document that separated us from the mother country. It was the moral impulse. All men are created equal. Oh, but Lincoln was asked, but isn't it quite obvious that the founders did not make all people equal? Well, he said that is true. They weren't equal in all ways. This was a trajectory towards which we should advance. He said, it's like Jesus' words, be ye perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. It is not that Jesus thought we were perfect, Lincoln said, but this is the impulse towards which we should move, and we will move the ball, so to speak, to use our idiom, further forward in our own time. But the question remains, what did Lincoln really feel about African Americans? Perhaps he was putting into place the Emancipation Proclamation as a military maneuver, as a political strategy, and this is a fair question. In the Emancipation Proclamation, there was a proviso, not too much noticed at the time, of blacks participating in the military. Now, most did not believe they would fight on the front lines, but would somehow serve in the back lines. Union soldiers said, we did not sign up to free Negroes, we signed up to free the Union. Lincoln was one of those who doubted the ability of blacks to fight. After all, most of the blacks in the military were from the South. They had been forced into a role of docility or passivity. But Lincoln, led by Secretary of War Stanton, by some of his generals, finally Ulysses S. Grant, began to see the possibility of what blacks could do in the military. In the summer of 1863, he received an invitation to return home to Springfield to give a speech at the largest Union rally of the war, 50,000 people. Oh, how he wanted to go home. He could take the train and be greeted all the way along, but he finally decided he could not. So he sent a letter. It's called A Letter in the Collected Works. It's a speech that he asked his friend James Conkling to read. How could he speak to 50,000 people? There were 7 speaking stands that day at the Illinois Fairgrounds in Springfield. And the next selection is from that speech. It is an indication of what Lincoln feels now at the end of the summer of 1863 about black soldiers. He begins by saying, peace does not appear so distant as it did. I hope it will come soon and come to stay, and so come as to be worth the keeping in all future time. It will then have been proved that among free men there can be no successful appeal from the ballot to the bullet. Oh, how Lincoln loved alliteration. And that they who take such appeal are sure to lose their case and pay the cost. And then these words, which took people by surprise. And then there will be some black men who can remember that with silent tongue and clenched teeth and steady eye and well-poised bayonet, they have helped mankind on to this great consummation. Oh, if he would have stopped there, that would have been radical enough in central southern Illinois, but he will not stop. While I fear there will be some white ones, unable to forget that with malignant heart and deceitful speech, they have strove to hinder it. The abolitionists were surprised and gratified by this speech. Almost forgotten today, it became a memorable part of Lincoln's re-election campaign in 1864. One more window and your time for comments and questions. The portrait of Lincoln has often been that he is a non-religious person. To prove this, it is pointed out that he, almost alone among our presidents, did not join a church, which is true. The problem with this, of course, is that when one comes to the second inaugural address, the most profound blending of religion and politics in all of American history, where in 701 words Lincoln mentions God 14 times, quotes the Bible 4 times, and invokes prayer 3 times, we're forced to ask, what's going on here? Well, 2 answers have come. I have been told these answers many times. I remember one evening in Washington, D.C., a congressman told me the answer. He said, it's nothing more than Lincoln, a cultured person in the middle of the 19th century, quoting the Bible as one would quote the Bible and one would quote Shakespeare. Nothing more. Professor White, don't read anything more into it. Thank you very much. Or the second option, which has some cogency, is that Lincoln is a shrewd politician, which he is, and he recognizes as he does who is the audience, and he's speaking to an audience that is largely religious. I ask those questions myself today when I hear religion used by every single politician of both parties, and I'm asking myself, what's going on here? Does this really have integrity, or is this a smart politician speaking to a largely religious audience? Well, how to answer that question? Central in Lincoln's attempt to define himself are these little scraps of paper by which he writes over and over and over again. They're on all manner of subjects. They always begin with a question. He's always puzzling out, he's brooding, he's reflecting. They don't come often to some final, simple, absolute answer, but it's part of his intellectual curiosity. He's a man of ideas. One of the most intriguing papers was written in 1862, I thought, maybe now 1864. It's not dated. It's lined, and I traveled to Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island to hold it in my hand. It's our last selection. Lincoln privately has been thinking for some time about the question, where is God in the midst of the Civil War? Raised in a Baptist background where he could not ask the questions he wanted, he moves as being a scoffer and a skeptic, but now under the duress of all the problems confronting him, probably the most being the death of Willie Lincoln in February 1862, he is thinking afresh about the question, where is God and who is God? And he writes out this little reflection. Now, you and I can read it in 90 seconds. I suggest it took him 4 or 5 hours. By that I mean he's puzzling, he's struggling. The will of God prevails. In great contests, each party claims to act in accordance with the will of God. Both may be, and one must be wrong. Listen to the logical Lincoln. God cannot be for and against the same thing at the same time. And then this profound sentence. In the present Civil War, it is quite possible that God's purpose is something different from the purpose of either party. Lincoln was very much attuned to the misuse of religion as well as the use of religion. He had become very upset with delegations of ministers who had come to him to say, God is on our side, God is on our side. As he knew, other delegations of ministers were coming to Jefferson Davis to say, God is on our side, God is on our side. And Lincoln is asking the presumptuousness of this. Is this a tribal God who takes sides in this war? And yet the human instrumentalities, working just as they do, are of the best adaptation to effect his purpose. I'm almost ready to say this is probably true, that God wills this contest and wills that it shall not end yet. By his mere quiet power, Lincoln did not like the noisiness of his youthful experience of religion. By his mere quiet power, on the minds of the now contestants, he could have either saved or destroyed the Union without a human contest. And having begun, he could give the final victory to either side any day. Yet the contest proceeds. Why do I suggest that this answers the question of the integrity of Lincoln's religious language and ideas? Because he never thought any of us would ever see this. It was found after his death in a bottom drawer of his desk by his young secretary, John Hay. But if you think about it, this is the intellectual foundation of the second inaugural address, where Lincoln will say in the central sentence of that address, the Almighty has his own purposes. That's exactly what he's saying here. I close with this. Lincoln was a person, conservative, moderate perhaps in temperament, a man who in that first great speech we read was almost sadly saying, all the great work of this nation was done by the founders. He says in the middle of that speech, all that is left to us is to transmit the ideas from the past to the present. All the great work had been done. And yet when he leaves from Springfield to go to Washington, and I believe he spoke spontaneously, he says, I go with a task greater than Washington. Not that he is greater than Washington, but the task is greater than Washington. So the man of precedent, trained as a lawyer to believe and respect precedent, who brings the Declaration of Independence into the political conversation because it is the precedent by which we ought to go forward. I suggest, in the middle of the war, begins to think in the future tense. He now recognizes that every generation must redefine America for its own time. As good and great as the past may have been, that is not sufficient for what we are facing today. So Lincoln says in what we would call the State of the Union address, it was the annual message to Congress, the dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate for the stormy present. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. Why should we be talking about Abraham Lincoln in 2009? Well, it's not because he can help us solve the question of climate change, nor stem cell research. He can't advise President Obama on all the various issues that he is facing. But I do believe that he gives to all of us a habit of mind and the humility of spirit. So that strangely, I'm feeling in this year 2009 that as we try to solve these very difficult and complex problems, Abraham Lincoln is becoming somehow strangely contemporary. Thank you very much. Strangely contemporary. Now we have a time for comments and questions, and we have people circulating with microphones, so stick your hand up and they'll come and find you. Yes, sir.
You mentioned Lecompton, Kansas, and the Lecompton Constitution several times in your book. What role did the Constitution play in the Lincoln-Douglas debate and in the eventual election of President Lincoln?
Well, Lecompton, of course, was a difficult issue for Douglas because on the one hand, he believed in popular sovereignty, and yet he thought Lecompton was a sham, and so he sort of broke with his own party. Lincoln's view of slavery, and this is sometimes hard to articulate, I think, especially sometimes to students. Many of the most important letters that he's written, for example, the letter to Horace Greeley where he said, I would save the Union by freeing the slaves or not freeing the slaves. But what's often forgotten is the last sentence or two says, but as for my personal opinion, I believe that all men should be free. So Lincoln felt himself bound by the Constitution. He said, if I did not want this office, I should not have taken the oath. The oath was that the Constitution did not allow him to deal with slavery where it already existed. And therefore he was caught in this continual struggle between his own personal wishes and his public duty. The classic example for me of this is the meeting he held on a Saturday morning at the end of March in 1864. 3 men from Kentucky came to see him, including the governor, Thomas Bramlett. They were outraged. The governor had written him 4 letters. The governor claimed that Lincoln was depopulating the state of Kentucky by taking blacks off of the farms and putting them into the Union Army. So these men come and they're in a huff, and Lincoln sits down with them, and the first words he says spontaneously are, I am naturally anti-slavery. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel. Now, these were not 3 men from Massachusetts. These were 3 men from Kentucky. But at the end of that, he says, but on the other hand, I did not feel that I had the right to act on my own personal wishes. So this is the tension in trying to understand the complexity of the situation Lincoln faced. Yes?
I don't want to get political, but there's a lot of comparison between Obama and Lincoln. And the overriding problem I see is that we do have better communication from bottom to top now and from top to bottom, and somehow it always seems like today that there are hidden agenda. What would Lincoln say to that?
Well, first of all, I was asked to write an essay of what we called, the editor called Memo to Barack Obama from Abraham Lincoln. And I think the problem that any modern president, Obama or anyone, faces is this instant rush to judgment. If we would have graded Lincoln in 1861, he wouldn't have even gotten a passing grade from many of us. 1862, maybe a C minus. And so Lincoln had to teach himself to be president. He started out with deference and respect towards his military leaders. And then he changed his mind as he saw that he was teaching himself military theory and he didn't necessarily agree with them. So I think the question of the modern presidency and the 24/7 coverage is that we don't even give a person time to teach themselves to be president. And therefore, there's a great difficulty in here in how we're going to evaluate modern presidents. Not to say that Lincoln's time wasn't filled with acrimony and very politicized press, but ours is ramped up far much more. Yes?
You talked earlier about Lincoln being particularly American, and that brought to my mind his early hero, Henry Clay.
Yes.
But curiously, I think the other American president who also had a very similar background to Lincoln's, an enemy of Clay's, would be Andrew Jackson, who is also very particularly American. How do you handle such a different character, but both being particular to the American nation?
Very, very good question. Well, Henry Clay was, in Lincoln's words in the eulogy that he gave on Clay, was his beau ideal of a statesman, a Kentuckian who had this so-called American system, kind of an economic nationalism of the Republican, Whig Party become Republican Party. He admired him greatly. He did not admire Andrew Jackson early on. The Whigs made fun of what they called King Andrew, this autocrat, dictator, running a party filled with corruption. However, there was an oil painting of Andrew Jackson that sat in President Abraham Lincoln's office. Now, maybe it's because it's the chair in which you sit. He understood and remembered how Andrew Jackson had challenged South Carolina in 1832 when they raised the head of nullification. Perhaps Lincoln understood that there was a need for a strong presidency. Part of this is what Jonathan Earl said at a dinner time conversation, and that is Lincoln's marvelous capacity to change his mind. Here was the titan of the other party, Andrew Jackson, but by the time Lincoln became president, he admired part of Jackson and his presidency. Yes.
Early in your remarks, you used the term moral compass.
Yes.
Could you please explain or expand on that further?
Yes. A long time ago now, when I was young, David Reesman wrote a book called The Lonely Crowd, in which he distinguished the way we take our marching orders. He argued that at the beginning of the 20th century, people were what he called inner-directed. Their moral compass was inward. It was Lincoln receiving a check from a person for whom he had defended in court, and the check was for $25, and Lincoln wrote back and said, "Thank you very much, but my fee is $15. Herewith find a check back to you for $10." That's an inner-directed person. Reesman argues that by the middle of the 20th century, we have become other-directed people. Our moral compass is actually what other people tell us it should be. Nowhere is this more true today, I think, where we've lost the up and down relationship of children and parents, and it's a completely vertical relationship. Children and teenagers are receiving their direction not from parents often, but from others. Lincoln was inner-directed. He had a strong sense of what was right and wrong. He could be criticized for not holding cabinet meetings often enough. He didn't take votes. The vote to resupply Fort Sumter was 6-1 against it. But he kept asking the question and finally saying, "Gentlemen, I've decided to resupply Fort Sumter." And so there's something interior about Lincoln, but yet in that interior compass was also the capacity to change his mind. So this, I think, is what's fascinating about him.
Earlier you talked about the scraps of paper that Lincoln had and its insights to telling us about his religious beliefs and how that changed. Are those going to come together in a new work? I'm very interested in that topic. So,
in a new work about the scraps of paper or his religious belief? Either. Okay. Well, it would be fascinating, wouldn't it? I mean, they're not a strict intellectual diary, but it's a way of showing how Lincoln thinks through problems. It's more difficult to think of writing a book on Lincoln's religious beliefs because we just don't know enough. But there certainly are evidences that I'm suggesting of how he grows and changes. And at this very moment, I'm trying to transcribe some of the sermons of Phineas Densmore Gurley that have laid all these years in the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia. And there's more than 50 of them. They're not dated, but I kind of think ministers don't change too much through the years. And therefore, this is what Lincoln was listening to. And the first Sunday after Fort Sumter, Lincoln goes to church and we have the sermon, and Phineas Densmore Gurley speaks about the scourge of war. Well, in the second inaugural, Lincoln talks about the mighty scourge of war. I mean, he's really listening to this person. I argue he's kind of the missing person in the Lincoln story. Here's someone up here. Yeah.
We've heard others speak, and you touched briefly on Lincoln's depression.
Yes.
What role do you think that played while he was president?
Lincoln struggled all his life, I believe, with depression. Several weeks ago, a psychiatrist in a meeting just like this talked with me afterwards and said, "You realize, don't you, that people who suffer from depression do so in part because they see reality more clearly than the rest of us. They feel it more deeply. They're aware of the pain in themselves and others." After telling me that, which I thought was very insightful, he said, "But don't confuse depression with sadness." He said they're two different realities. Lincoln, he said, was also sad. He had a lot of reason to be sad. The death of his mother, his sister, on and on and on. So Joshua Schenck, in his book, Lincoln's Melancholy, makes the suggestion, which I find very hospitable, that sometimes those who suffer from these sort of mental tortures, it can allow them to become more empathetic to others. And I think this may be true with Lincoln. Yes, sir.
Thank you for coming. I wanted to ask you about the eloquence of a letter that he wrote to a Mrs. Bixby, who lost 5 sons in the field of battle. I don't know whether you can recall that sufficiently for us, but that's the most eloquent thing I've ever read, ever. And it's amazing to me he could sit down and write that thing out. It almost makes me cry to read it. And that's, 150 years ago.
The reference is to the letter to Mrs. Bixby, who Lincoln believed had lost 5 sons in battle. There's quite a debate in the Lincoln community. Your last speaker would argue that Lincoln didn't write that letter, that it was written by John Hay. I sort of believe he did write the letter. We know that John Hay did write some of Lincoln's letters. Secretaries write letters for people all the time. But it is also an evidence, isn't it, that it wasn't simply in Lincoln's public speeches that he was eloquent. You used the word eloquent. But that he could take these letters, which only one person was ever going to see, and write such deep eloquence, such caring for parents who had lost someone in battle. So yes, I agree with you. It's one of the most profound things I've ever read.
I think the audience would like to hear you speak on something you did this afternoon, which was speaking about probably what were the original lobbyists, ordinary citizens coming to the White House.
Okay. I was asked at a gathering this afternoon to speak about Lincoln's relationships with the public. And I made the point that Lincoln came to the White House with no administrative experience, and the first few months didn't augur very well. People observed him, kind of had a haphazard system. His secretaries tried to impose some organization, but he was always breaking free from the organization. And one reason he broke free from the organization was he wanted to see and hear from ordinary people. So several afternoons a week, he held literally an open house. And all sorts of people just kind of trundled in to talk to him. And when people tried to stop this, he said, "These are my public opinion baths. These are my public opinion baths. I need to hear what ordinary people are seeing, are hearing, and thinking." And so he refused, for most of his presidency, to shut the door on this and continued to speak to ordinary people.
And you cite an example of the comedian Lincoln and how he used it during the stress of the Civil War and how it could apply to us today.
Thank you. Lincoln is the president who laughs with us. And notice not laughs at us. That's a modern part of late talk show, laughs at us. Laughs with us. During the Civil War, in telling these stories, people said, "How in the world in this moment of great seriousness and stress you can tell these funny stories?" He said, "If I didn't tell these funny stories, I might cry." Lincoln had a habit of visiting the home of George McClellan, to McClellan's great consternation. And McClellan would write letters to his wife just lambasting Lincoln. You know, he called Lincoln the original guerrilla. He told his wife that Lincoln came telling these stupid, silly stories to him. But part of the strategy there was he was sizing up McClellan. He would just sort of tell these stories. They're not jokes. They are stories that gain their potency out of Lincoln's understanding of the culture around him. He just did it all the time. On his trip from Springfield to Washington, he would get off the train and he would say, "Oh, it's so wonderful to see the women here." He said, I have such a much better view of you than you do of me." And he was always making fun of his kind of ugly looks and not very handsome demeanor, and just on and on and on of these stories. This is part of who he was. His humor was self-deprecating. Again, think of modern politicians. We're so serious. We don't hear many self-deprecating, humorous stories from modern politicians. We did from Bob Dole. That was one of the things I liked about him. Yeah. Yes?
One of the things I noticed is that there are very few students here compared to non-students. And one of the things you spoke about earlier in your presentation was that the teachers are struggling to put Lincoln into the curriculum. Do you see any correlation between that there are very few students here and they're not being taught in school? And does that worry you, especially the fact that Lincoln does embody the American experience, that his legacy is being lost, especially in the hard times that we're having as a country?
That's quite a profound observation that I'd never quite thought about before. The observation is that there are few students here. Maybe they're all doing their homework. But the idea is that correlated with the fact that Lincoln is perhaps not taught in the same way? That very well may be true. A gentleman came up to me a couple of weeks ago at a book signing in Connecticut, and I knew he wanted to talk to me. It was before the book signing, and so he said, "I just have this one thing to say to you after reading your book." He said, "I think what's really important is how are we bound together as a nation?" He said, "I do not believe we are bound together as a nation by ethnicities. We are bound together by ideas, and my question is, are those ideas being taught?" And so that's the central question. I mean, I think Lincoln, when you asked the earlier question, why should we be interested in Lincoln, what is important about him, is that Lincoln is a very central person in kind of formulating the central ideas of what it means, what's the promise of America.
We have lots of information about the Gettysburg Address, and it's fantastic. Did Lincoln make private emotional reactions to the victory at Gettysburg, and how did he respond to Meade after that?
Well, I told you the story of how people came to the White House after Gettysburg and Vicksburg, and he gave a little speech. The problem after Gettysburg, and this is another characteristic of Lincoln, you're asking about General Meade, who had been put in charge of the Union forces just days before Gettysburg. And so, in a sense, should gain the acclaim that he wins the Battle of Gettysburg. But then Meade, who sort of has Lee and his troops on the run, he doesn't follow them. And Lincoln is just filled with anger. Day after day after day goes by. Lee arrives at the Potomac River and he can't get over it because it's flooding. And so Lee is trapped in Pennsylvania, but still Meade dallies. And finally Meade sends a force and gets to the Potomac River and discovers Lee has just passed over it with all of his troops. So Lincoln sits down and he writes a letter to Meade. And by golly, he is going to tell him what he thinks. And he writes this letter out. And in the Lincoln files, there is Lincoln's handwritten signature, A. Lincoln. And in the envelope, it says, never stamped, never sent. He understood that if he wrote this letter to Meade after Meade's great victory, it would so destroy Meade. So again and again and again in the Lincoln papers are never stamped, never sent. Lincoln must have written 7 or 8 great letters that he never sent. That says so much about Lincoln. He understood how far he could go, and he pulled back and said, I feel this way. My favorite letter is the letter he wrote to Grant after Vicksburg. He congratulates him, but he does it in this way. He said, General Grant, when you decided to go into Mississippi, I was convinced you were wrong. When you decided to do this, you were incorrect. When you decided to do that, I was sure you were mistaken. When you decided to do this, and he simply concludes, General Grant, I was wrong, and you were right. Respectfully, A. Lincoln. Just unbelievable.
I'm afraid that's all the time we have for tonight. I want to thank Ronald White for coming to the Dole Institute and giving such a fantastic lecture. And as you heard, Professor White will be signing copies of A. Lincoln at a table on the way out, just under the Russell window. And if you wouldn't mind cooperating, I'm going to take him around the back. And if you have something to say, I think he'd be very happy to talk to you at the signing table. Thanks a lot for coming.